Welcome to a Parallel Project Training, APM Project Management Qualification podcast based on the APM Body of Knowledge 7th edition. You should be using this in conjunction with our e-learning, podcasts, and potentially a tutor-led course. For more information, please visit www.parallelprojecttraining.com.
Welcome everybody to another Parallel Project Training podcast. My name is John Bolton. We're going to be going through the Body of Knowledge 7th edition sections on requirements management and configuration management today. I've got with me Jan Underdown. Hello Jan.
Hi Dan.
Hi. Jan's going to help me because Jan's a real whiz at all this. She knows all the ins and outs about requirements capture.
I don't know about
and all
that, John.
Yeah, you do. You do. And you were telling me all about your configuration management stuff with your aeroplanes. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
Okay. So we're going to talk about how we're going to keep scope under control using a decent requirements management process, and also making sure that we've got configuration management nailed. And configuration management is the one that everybody gets confused about, don't they? They get really confused about that.
Yes, they often call it document control within organisations.
There is a bit of that to it, though, isn't there? Yes,
there is.
Yeah. Let's start with requirements.
Okay.
So the project manager is going to be making stuff, and they need to know what stuff to make, don't they? So can you talk me through a little requirements management process or activities that they do?
Yes, it's an interesting process because it takes in an awful lot of stakeholders' views and primarily the kind of users' views. But what you have to watch is the requirements are the thing that we're actually going to deliver out of the project as part of the output. And so we need to actually then drill down into the actual scope of it. So what is the requirements? And also it's the output, the requirements, which then will generate, when it goes into the BAU, the actual benefits, the outcomes and benefits we actually want. So we need to understand what the business actually needs as well to create these outcomes and benefits. But what we do in requirements, we start to drill down. Now, it sounds okay, so how do we do that? Well, it's like yesterday, I do a lot of running, and I actually had 5 people with me, and I actually had an order of 5 different types of coffee. Each person had their own view of coffee. Okay, so
So you were buying the coffee for the running team, were you?
Running team, yes. So which
I thought you were drinking all those high energy drinks. I thought that's
no, you
just a good shot of caffeine halfway around.
Absolutely. Well, it's a coffee that keeps us, good recovery. So which is correct coffee? So who would actually decide within a project environment? Who do you think would decide?
Well, who wants the coffee?
Who wants the coffee?
What coffee do you want? Well, I suppose if I was, I don't know, I just drink black cheap,
so do I.
Coffee.
Yes, but for some people it can get quite complex. It's like they may want a particular type of coffee, a bit of strength, 1 shot, 2 shot. If you go into the cappuccino, some people actually have requirements for different types of milk. It's incredible, from almond milk to low fat, full fat. To
I suppose if you've got a medical condition, I mean that might be a bit of a kind of showstopper, mightn't it?
That's right.
If you've got something that stops you drinking cow's milk, then that would be a very clear requirement.
Well, absolutely, if you're lactose intolerant, absolutely. So you can get down into those sort of areas. I mean, just using coffee as a vehicle to actually kind of explain sometimes how our users and different stakeholders have views. So who will decide? So on behalf of the business, then you would actually have the sponsor would then sign off and say, right, that's the requirements we're going to have.
The sponsor's not actually saying what they want, though, are they?
No, they're not.
So
they're not.
Who's this? This is the user community, is it?
This is the user community and the stakeholders community. And also, this can get quite complex, especially when you're working with communities, like some of the councils we kind of work with as well, is what they're looking for. So who actually decides what will actually have the ability to achieve the outcomes and benefits.
So if two people, one person wants a green one and one person wants whatever it is, somebody wants a blue one, somebody wants a green one, it's the sponsor that makes the decision?
That's right, yeah, because they're paying for the project at the end of the day and their responsibility overall for the actual project.
So should we talk about can you just talk me through the process of how we go about gathering these requirements then? Because you've got to try and get them from, you mentioned potentially a huge community of people. How do you go about doing that? What sorts of ways can you do that?
Well, there's lots of different ways. You can actually have brainstorming getting people in the room and actually kind of validating the kind of requirements. You can actually even go into prioritising requirements. We often use the MOSCO analysis. And MOSCO stands for is must, should, could, and won't get. Now, must is in short term for minimal usable subset. What is the minimum we require to actually get those outcomes and benefits? And they really are the prioritisation of that. And what should be less important than must, but if we don't get the shoulds, and sometimes the shoulds may incorporate some maybe legal requirements, like your coffee should be a particular type of temperature, for example, particular strength, and could gives you kind of tolerance. If things go well, we have the time and money to deliver it, then we could actually get those done. And the won'ts is really a method of de-scoping requirements. Okay. We will not get that done.
So this is,
we don't have the money for it.
This is what you refer to as the MOSCO list, is it?
Yes,
like Moscow
right.
as in Russia without the O.
No, without
so
the O's,
must have,
yes.
should have, could have, won't have. Can we just come back a little bit to how you gather them in the first place? Because that's part of analysis, isn't it, the Moscow
list?
Yes,
it is. And you can actually have questionings, questionnaires and data gathering.
Okay. So brainstorming, you said, questionnaires.
Yes, maybe looking at legislation, what we require to be...
okay, so what sort of example would that be?
Something. We had GDPR last year.
So that's right. So it's a must-have requirement to make sure that you've got a privacy statement on your website.
That's right,
sort of
and things like that, and also what those privacy statements need to say.
So they're not kind of requirements that are optional, are they?
Yeah, how you're collecting data, how you're storing data, people have access to the data.
So any other ways of gathering requirements?
You can actually do prototyping. We work within science and technology communities. They'll maybe do prototyping, especially if the user group don't quite understand what they're requiring. They may be coming to you as an organisation to say, well, we want one of these things that can do that, have that particular outcome. So then you come to you as an organisation, as the experts, to maybe produce a prototype or a model. Would this do? Is that what you're kind of looking for? So there's those sort of things.
And we're going to go out to the community. So we go through the analysis process. Then we go through the capture process. Then we sort of analyse them, look at them for the Moscow list you talked about. And,
that's right.
Various other ways of doing that. I suppose money would be
absolutely timescales, money.
Because if I wanted some rare exotic breed of Costa Rican coffee,
that's right,
you might go, I'm not going to pay for that.
That's right, and also the value of that as well. And also you can actually use in lots of cases your product breakdown structure. Remember we talked about that in scope. Different breakdowns. You can actually start to drill down and also look at the quality criteria of each of those components, and that will then lead into your quality and your quality management aspect. So quality and requirements are very closely aligned. So, so you want the Costa Rican coffee. So what criteria was it have a particular type of strength? Do you actually want traceability that is actually ethically sourced, it's been grown in a particular way, even down to that.
They're very big on that in the meat industry, aren't they? When I go into my local butchers, they kind of almost got a number of the, they know the cow's name, if you like.
Yes, and when it was slaughtered and all that sort of stuff, that gets a bit, what's the name of it really? Okay, so there's and also you talked about there are different parameters, like what the client will actually pay for or the organisation will pay for. What is the timescales requiring it as well? Because sometimes we may not be able to build the whole of the requirements, so we may actually use something like an agile approach to develop the minimal usable subset apart and then move on.
Okay. So in terms of quality then, if you're talking about the relationship with quality, it presupposes that you've got some sort of absolute definition of these things. Where would you write the requirements down? They go into the specification, do they?
Yes.
Okay. And then that allows you to test it afterwards.
Absolutely.
Because that's where this whole idea of this V model comes in, doesn't it?
Yeah, the V model is very good to show that, actually. And also because with the V model, you're almost starting with the end in mind. The functional requirements, what will be the acceptance criteria that the client's looking for? And that can actually enable you to justification and also the prioritisation.
Okay, because the requirements change as you go down that V, don't they? As you get further down the V, they become more precise, but tend to be more technical as well.
Well, it's even like the technical requirements. You've got to think about how we're going to test that. What is the actual testing, the quality criteria and the quality control.
So a functional requirement for your cup of coffee then is that it tastes okay.
It tastes okay.
It's
I
all right,
enjoy
I like
it.
it's
It's got the
warm.
right kind of kick
Okay.
to it.
So what would be a technical requirement for a cup of coffee?
Technical requirement, it has to be one shot, which is a calibrated shot. It has to be a certain temperature, so degrees C
That's
of
right.
temperature.
Okay. That's been a cup.
Has been a cup.
You like drink it out
I
of
don't know.
straws,
Yeah,
don't you?
drip feed me coffee.
Oh, fine. Yeah, you just drink it out of straws.
Yeah.
It's good. All right. And then once you've got the requirements specific, you can be absolute about how you test them, can't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that leads into the quality control. And also you may actually have legal requirements around safety or other legislation it has to meet. Like making the coffee, you have to follow food and health and food safety and kind of legislation and things like that.
Cool. So should we talk a bit about configuration management?
Yeah.
Because it gets people mightily confused, this, and it probably bears a little bit of an explanation, because they're almost uttered in the same breath when it comes to the syllabus. You've got requirements and configuration management.
Right.
And they're both talking about managing scope and all that stuff. So we've gathered the scope and we've got all that locked down in requirements, but presumably we need now to manage that
Yes,
through
we
the life of
do.
the job.
We do. Now, configuration management is a fancy term, and it's a term that's not used in organisations, but we all know it as document control or version control. And configuration management is very important. So how many times you've been to a meeting, God help us, where we actually have different versions of documentation on the table, and we spend more time trying to figure out which is the correct version, what we call the single source of truth. Even more embarrassing if you sat in front of a client. So configuration management or version document control looks after what we call the assets of the project. And assets are fancy terms of technical assets, which is your output. And of course, we look at after the documentation of the output, like an aircraft, for example. And also the management assets, the version control of things like the business case, the schedules. So everybody's working to the same documentation. And so we actually, when we baseline something, that's when that version. But we have to plan all of this. So, who's actually going to control the version control or document control of the project? Usually the project manager is in charge of this. You may actually have a project support office, perhaps. But also, what are the roles and responsibilities? This is often where sometimes a product owner may be actually involved, and he will coordinate that. Because don't forget, sometimes the documentation...
Sorry, but I beg your pardon, what does a product owner coordinate?
The actual technical assets, the actual configuration, documentation around that particular product.
Okay.
Like, for example...
So who's running... There's a configuration management process.
Yes, there's a process.
And there's some steps in that process.
Absolutely.
Like there usually is.
So we were talking about the planning just now.
So planning.
Yes.
So
the roles and responsibilities, where we're going to store the configuration, security access, because they are valuable assets. You've got to think about IPR, for example, may come into that version.
Okay.
And also, there's the actual part of that process is configuration identification. And we can actually go back, if you're using product breakdown structures, we can actually identify the various products. So, for example, if you pick up a document, how do you know which does that belong to? Do we have, numbering conventions? Do we have naming conventions? Is there a list of all the documents that support that particular product?
So how would a product breakdown structure help with that then?
It shows you the configuration of the actual output.
So the
and so its
relationship
main
between
component
one product
parts.
and another?
Yes, it does.
So the idea of configuration, the whole idea of configuration management then is to make sure that if you've got two bits, they both work together.
That's absolutely
Is that
right.
So
yes.
if I've got a pen and a pen cap, they fit.
Well, it's like your car. Your car is a configured item. Each car is a configuration, a sum of. So you need particular types of tyres, particular type of engine. The engine itself is broken down into component parts. So when your car breaks down, they just ask you for your registration or what you said before, the VIN number, and they know exactly what parts are fitted to that car or what is compatible with that car.
Okay.
That's configuration.
So that's configuration identification of those
That's
parts.
absolutely right, yes.
And you mentioned configuration control.
Yes, that's important, because configuration control is if we make changes to the scope or to the requirements, we need to make sure that we have to do impact analysis. If we move that bit or change that, would it still work? Will it still actually link up with its component parts? And that's important. It's like if you change a piece of code in an IT system, it can actually have really huge impact and adverse effects. So we need to make sure that, and also who's actually working on the product, who actually has copies of the documentation, what version numbers are we running. If you actually have lots of different clients, they could be running different version numbers of very similar products, but they're working in very different ways. So who controls that? And also making sure that any changes are done in a very controlled way, the impact analysis is done, and also once the product is up-versioned, then the distribution to people who need to have that information, they actually have the right version number, the right documentation. And that's very, very important. And also moving on to status accounting, I call that the single source of truth. So what is the correct version of this document? Where would I go to find that?
Okay, who keeps the... So presumably you're doing status accounting. It always seemed quite logical to me because you account for money.
Yes.
And you account for time.
Yes.
And your Gantt chart, your money in your budget and cost accounts. And it didn't seem unreasonable that you account for your products as well.
Products, absolutely right.
And that's what a status account is, isn't it? I think.
It is. It is.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So your status account, if you go from version 1 to version 2, the project manager will make sure that...
And also what triggered that version as well, we're linked
So
to
the
a change
whole
control
history,
system. Absolutely.
Because
the whole history
at
of it.
some point you might want to audit it, I guess.
Absolutely. And some organisations are very stringent audits. You mentioned before, I've worked in the aviation industry. If you want an audit, the Civil Aviation Authority will go through every piece of paper, even down to the batch number of the materials that were used on the job.
Well, I suppose it's quite important if you're building
It's
an
very
aircraft engine,
important.
isn't it? Yeah.
And you can do it on cars. I don't know if people know that all your tyres are traceable. If they have a dud batch of rubber or tyres, they know exactly through the traceability where that. And does the system actually work? So the auditing is very important. They can be legal requirements.
So basically, sum up then, really, you gather the requirements, baseline them.
Yes.
Then as you're running the job, you make sure that any changes to it are recorded.
Right.
You go through the change control process
Yes.
to make sure that it's all properly documented. And sorry, the configuration management process to make sure it's all properly documented.
Absolutely.
Then you get to the end and hopefully you'll be able to test it.
Absolutely.
Against the specifications.
And also then that's
even
recorded.
Even though they might have changed through the life of the job. Okay.
And that's recorded.
There's a useful little acronym, isn't there, for configuration management?
Yes, it's called PIXA.
PIXA.
Yes.
Ever since I've
Planning.
been involved in project management, I've had this acronym drummed into me.
Absolutely.
PICSA. It's like that song, was it YMCA, isn't it? Is it PICSA?
I think we'll stop there, John.
Yeah, right, okay. Well, thanks very much, Jan.
Okay.
Very helpful, and speak to you again soon.
Okay, thanks, John.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast and found it informative. To find out about our training courses, e-learning or tutor-led course, please go to www.parallelprojecttraining.com.